Good morning, and thank you for having me. What I want to do today is both celebrate and complicate the potential of practicing community geographies using an example of a community-based research project I've been doing since 2004 in Chicago in a neighborhood experiencing gentrification, a primarily Mexican and Mexican-American neighborhood called Pilsen. And I've been working with an organization called the Pilsen Alliance. Um, and so my involvement started as a community-based service learning class with very well-defined goals, right? So what the community organization had asked from a team of us was to look for ways to kind of prove that gentrification was happening. So to look at, the statistics that we could provide to illustrate the way in which gentrification was affecting the neighborhood. And so we did that by collecting a whole bunch of data on land use and zoning and ownership and property taxes for over time, every property in the neighborhood. And from that, learned really useful things, right, that had relevance both to research and to policy, primarily around zoning. So what we found, as an example, was that the neighborhood was zoned for higher density use than it was actually being used for. So that made it very attractive for speculators to come in, knock down a building, and build a higher density building in terms of number of units than had been there previously. And so there was a real profit potential to be realized here. And the other thing that we learned was that many people who are eligible for property tax exemptions as homeowners or as senior citizens were not claiming those exemptions. So these were two kind of actionable things that were both relevant to the literature and relevant to the people on the ground, right? And so it was a real great example of how doing community geography can both inform research, but then also have an effect on the ground. And so one of the things that we did as a result was to pass a downzoning referendum in the neighborhood. It was non-binding, and so it didn't actually become law, but it did pass with 75% of the vote in the neighborhood. So it showed that there was this real kind of groundswell in the community against the way in which the neighborhood was gentrifying. And then the other thing that was possible as a result of the research was to hold workshops teaching people how to claim the property tax exemptions that they had been letting go. So that was a real kind of like practical way in which the research and the activism came together. And that was a great example, kind of the best of doing community-based research. But then sort of over time, sometimes it's kind of hard to see how the research and the activism come together, in that you are often, as an academic, kind of pulled in different directions based on what's happening on the ground, right? So one of the kind of biggest sometimes hurdles for doing community geography can be the mismatch between academic time and activist time, right? So academic time, as we all know, is very kind of slow and deliberative. Things don't really happen quickly often. And certainly the publication part of doing this kind of research doesn't happen quickly. Whereas activist time is always, right, it's always an emergency. You're always sort of putting out multiple fires at the same time. And so over my involvement since 2004 with this group, lots of times I felt sort of pulled in a million different directions at once, which maybe is, and hopefully is helpful to the community group, but isn't necessarily obvious as to how it advances your research agenda, right? And so sometimes you can feel kind of pulled away from the work and even honestly the area of expertise that you claim in order to be useful to your community partner. So for example, over the course of the time I've been doing this research in Pilsen, there has been interest in policies like community land trust. And so kind of spur of the moment, I'm expected to be an expert in community land trust. And so, kind of brush up on that literature. Fairly recently, there was a proposal by the city to make much of the neighborhood and specifically the main commercial strip of the neighborhood, a landmark district, right? And the community was really concerned about what that would do to property values and the cost of maintenance and things like that. And so I was kind of forced to become an instant expert in landmarking and historic preservation, which is not my area of expertise and is not something that I had done research on previously. And so kind of the complicating factor that I want people to be more aware of when doing community work is how sometimes the research agenda and the activism don't always match up as beautifully as one would hope and as beautifully as they did when I started with this project. Sometimes you can definitely feel pulled away from what is technically your research agenda in order to be the best ally you can be for your community partner. And so that is something that for many years, in fact, so while I've been doing this work in Pilsen for a long time, for 17 years now, I haven't actually published that much on it. And that's been because I felt so kind of deep in the work. And again, as I mentioned, kind of being pulled in different directions based on what the community group is interested in and what kind of crises are happening on the ground that need to be dealt with. But also sometimes when you're doing that, it's then hard to see how what you're dealing with is kind of different from what has already been written about, right? That from much of my experience doing this work in Pilsen, it's been kind of a textbook case of gentrification, which in one way that is useful to kind of illustrate, yep, this is what happened, like what we expect to happen based on the literature is what's happening in this case. But sometimes then it can be hard to see, well, what does this experience bring to the literature? Like, what can I add to the literature that is new, right? How is this not just another case study, right? What can I bring to the research agenda part that's useful, that's strategic professionally, to be quite honest, while also continuing to be useful to your community partner. And so over time, the good thing about having a community engaged research project that happens over a long period of time is that eventually, right, not in the moment, because it's virtually impossible to do in the moment, but eventually you get to a place where you can see the arc, right? That you can see the way that a lot of the things that maybe you thought were tangential at the time actually are part and parcel of the core of the story, right? That over time you can see the ways in which everything fit together in a way that you didn't necessarily expect or understand while you were kind of going through it in crisis mode. And so what I've come to find out in this by this stage of my career, and when I've started to be able to have a little bit of the time to and the security, frankly, having gotten tenure and now as a full professor, to really look back on it and understand not just what I learned personally going through it, but what is new and interesting and different about this case study compared to perhaps other experiences in other places. One of the really interesting things in Pilsen that I've been thinking about now, right, that I sort of recognize because it's been such a long relationship, is how sort of extraordinary both the length and the strength of the resistance has been, and also the diversity of the techniques used in contesting gentrification. Some of those I've been actively involved in. So, for example, the downzoning referendum and the contesting of the historic district that I mentioned earlier, and others have been much more, kind of direct action, spur of the moment, immediate kind of anti-eviction campaigns or protesting of specific developers. But an interesting development now in Pilsen was the election of the executive director of the Pilsen Alliance, which I work with, to the local position of alderman, right? So the Pilsen's member of the city council, and being able to then see quite clearly the way in which a lot of the activism that we've talked about over the years can be or starting to be moved into policy. And recognizing then when you have someone who is a partner in the political realm, that there are very specific things that you can do to try to make a difference on the ground to contest gentrification that's happening. And so this has been quite interesting, extraordinary, relevant as a kind of cohort of more progressive aldermen were elected to city council in 2019. and seeing the way that policy is starting to change as a result. So two specific examples that I'll just mention very quickly that were introduced by the alderman in Pilsen, and again, a collection of other more progressive aldermen, is a demolition fee, right, to make it more expensive to do tear downs in the neighborhood, which had been a real problem in Pilsen. And also a deconversion fee. So a big issue with affordable housing in particular neighborhoods in Chicago is taking multi-unit buildings, typically 2 or 3 flats, and turning them into single-family homes, right? Just changing the zoning designation so that what had previously and historically been a pretty reliable form of affordable housing, these 2 and 3 flats, were becoming then very expensive single-family homes. And so both of these ordinances were introduced and passed by City Council as pilots. Pilsen was one of the neighborhoods where they were piloted. And 1 year in, the report so far is that they have actually been wildly successful, right? That they have virtually ceased demolitions and deconversions in both neighborhoods. So this has been really encouraging to see that sort of a lot of the things that we theorized and talked about and dreamed of and tried to advocate for actually coming into practice. And so I want to kind of end on that happy note, that celebratory note, that looks at the ways that doing community action work really can achieve change on the ground. And then just the complicating factor is that it doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't necessarily happen the way that you thought it would. And it takes a lot longer than I think anyone thinks that it will when they start out. So it's worth it in the end, but it's a challenging journey, right? And so I think a lot of people these days like to celebrate community geographies, and rightly so. It's absolutely something worth doing. But it's also long, can be hard and slow and complicated. But I think people need to then, go into it with eyes open and recognize that while it is long and hard and slow, it can also accomplish real change. And indeed, that is the point, right? That it's not about what I've come to see over this arc of time is it's not about, and it shouldn't be about, how many articles you can get out of it or, kind of celebrating your own relevance to the community, but rather about what can actually be accomplished on the ground, and thus proving your research agenda, which for me, ultimately, what most of my career has been about is trying to prove that gentrification is not inevitable, right? That it is the result of very specific policy choices and thus can be contested with very specific policy choices. And so it's taken a long time to get there, but this research project and this community-based work has enabled me to get there. So I hope that kind of serves as a model, both a little bit on the pro and the more complicated side of what practicing community geography actually looks like. Thank you.